Hello, my name is Phil, and I'm a doctor who likes to play board games, especially Uwe Rosenberg games. In this video, I'm going to do a comparison among three of his games that are strictly for two players, based off of some of his popular big box games. Those games are Agricola, All Creatures Big and Small, Le Havre, Inland Port, and Caverna, Cave vs. Cave. I'm going to go through a quick premise for each game, what is the same and what's different from their respective parent games, and then rank them from least to most favorite, in my opinion. Let's start with Agricola All Creatures Big and Small. This game came out in 2012, 5 years after Agricola's first edition. In it, you are once again building out a farm, but the mechanisms are simplified to just animal raising, which includes the breeding mechanism from the original game. You focus on acquiring resources such as wood and stone, creating pastures, acquiring animals, and finally placing building tiles for ongoing effects and scoring opportunities, all the while utilizing worker placement. In the original release, there was a set number of special buildings, in addition to the standard stall/stable tiles. 4 special buildings, in fact, that remained the same from game to game. However, in the same year, the first expansion called More Buildings Big and Small was released, introducing 27 new special buildings to add variety. The next year, in 2013, a second expansion titled Even More Buildings Big and Small was released, adding yet another 27 buildings to the collection. Finally, a big box version of the game was released in 2018 that included all of the expansion content and base game in one box. Of note, an app for All Creatures Big and Small was released by Digidiced in 2016, with access to the first expansion material only. 2012 not only saw the release of Agricola, All Creatures Big and Small, but also for Le Havre, Inland Port. This one was a two-player version that included the similar mechanisms from the parent game in terms of collecting resources and placing buildings onto your tableau and utilizing your opponent's buildings as well. However, this game created a new way to track the basic resources from the game utilizing a grid system. The buildings, rather than retain some of the mechanisms from the base game, interacted with this resource grid not only in cost, but also in how you gained resources. In other words, in which direction you moved your markers on the grid to determine resource count. The game features a static and predictable set of 31 buildings that become available to purchase, always at the same time from game to game, very similar to how buildings appear and how they work in another Rosenberg game or at Labora. No expansions came out after the release of the initial game, and an app version, also by Digidiced, for Inland Port was released in 2015. Finally, Caverna Cave vs. Cave first came out in 2017, 4 years after the original Caverna. This new game retained the premise of worker placement to collect resources and place building tiles onto your cave tableau, but it cut out the farming bits of the original game. One interesting aspect about this game is that instead of having all the buildings face up for you to build from, as in the original game, instead they were shuffled and placed face down onto your tableau, and you would have to excavate them to reveal the buildings that you could then later build from, thus creating variability throughout the game from game to game. In 2018, 1 year after the original game came out, the Era 2 expansion was released, introducing an additional 4 rounds to the game. 21 more rooms to build, and an additional sideboard were also released and allowed for players to explore even further. 4 years later, the big box version was released, condensing the base game and the first expansion. A second expansion was teased when Era 2 was released, promising to introduce agriculture, bring in more, perhaps, mechanisms from the original game to the Duel version, but I suppose Era 3 is a lost cause by now because it was never released and no news is known, at least to me. Now that the games are introduced, let's rank these games based on how well they portray their original games through mechanisms, both new and borrowed, and then I'll rank them based on my preferences. Starting at the bottom, I think the game that portrays their parent game the least is going to be Inland Port. However, one might say that Inland Port is the most unique of these three games. The simplicity of taking one worker and either gathering resources or using a building or building a building is somewhat preserved in either using a building or buying one in the Inland Port Duel version. However, the grid style mechanism of resource tracking and the complete overhaul of buildings to fit that grid mechanism makes it feel more different than what you're trying to accomplish in the base game. Even though the variability is somewhat limited in Le Havre, the base game, with how many or few special buildings you use, and the order of the standard ones that are repeatable from game to game, the variability is limited even further with the static repeatable setup in Inland Port. Next in the middle is Cave versus Cave. The worker placement and excavation mechanisms feel very similar to regular Caverna. Sure, the wall placement is a new thing in this version, but it's somewhat akin to having to build pastures in Caverna to keep animals. The fact, though, that there aren't any animals or crops to tend make this game makes it feel different, making it feel less of a sandbox experience and more of a focused, honed in experience in your cave. There is a little more randomness to what buildings become available, and that variability of which buildings you can build from and just the pool of buildings that you can try to build from game to game when you consider the expansion material doesn't make the game feel as static as the base game, so that is a huge difference between the two. Finally, I think All Creatures Big and Small feels the most similar to its parent game. Sure, crop management is gone, but the fact that you must gather resources, use them to build pastures, acquire stables and stalls, get breeding pairs, all of this utilizing tight worker placement, it really replicates the Agricola experience very well. Especially with the expansion material having additional variable buildings to play reminds me of the different combos you can search for and have with the occupations and minor improvements from those cards in regular Agricola. I would say that if I had to choose between playing the base Agricola versus All Creatures Big and Small with only two players, it's actually kind of a toss up for me of which one I would choose. Finally, let's rank the games based on how much fun I think they are. Once again, in last place is Inland Port. It suffers from being the same game every time, and while it creates a very chess like experience, I would rather have that limited variability from the parent game Le Havre itself, even at two players. Next, I think I would actually put All Creatures Big and Small next. It's a tough decision between this and Cave versus Cave, but ultimately, All Creatures Big and Small will never replace the experience of Agricola, especially when I have more than two players at the table. If I only had two players, I think out of all three of these games, I would go with Cave versus Cave because of the variability in buildings, creating a different experience every time you play, in which it shares with All Creatures Big and Small when you both consider the expansions for both games. But it feels like it's its own game. You know, it's similar but different enough, Caverna and Agricola for that matter, that it feels like it stands on its own. With All Creatures Big and Small being so similar to Agricola, I think I would rather turn to an experience that is not too similar yet not too different from its parent game at two players. Something right in the middle that's just right. And so I think that's why I would rather play Cave versus Cave if I had to choose from these three games. So that's it. That is my discussion on these three dual style games based off of the Harvest Trilogy from Uwe Rosenberg, some of his best hits yet. Let me know if you've played these games and what you think about them in the comments below. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you schedule an appointment with me real soon. Take care.